Picture this. He is sitting in a wooden chair in a government building in Shanghai, and a man in a white coat is telling him that the test results are back, that the lesions on his lung are real, that he has, at most, 6 months to live. He is 23 years old. He walks out of that building into the noise and heat of the street, and he does not cry, not yet. He just stands there, watching a cart horse struggle under the weight of its load, and he thinks, so that's it then, his name is Hu Zhi-min. And the story of what happened next is one that history almost forgot entirely. He was born in 1903 in a province most Westerners couldn't find on a map, the third son of a shopkeeper who kept meticulous ledgers and very little else. His father was not a cruel man. He was simply a precise one. There was a column for income and a column for expense, and sentiment did not appear in either. His mother was different, a woman who rose before dawn every morning not to cook or to clean, but to sit in the dark and pray. She prayed in a low voice, barely above a whisper, and sometimes young Zhi-min would creep to the doorway and watch her, not understanding what she was doing, but understanding something about the quality of her silence, that it was not empty, that something was filling it. When he was 7, she took him to a small gathering of Christians in a neighbor's house. There were perhaps 12 people seated on low stools, a single candle on the table, and a man reading from a book. Zhi-min didn't understand the words, but he watched his mother's face while the man read, and he saw something move across it, something he had no name for at 7 years old, but would spend the next 40 years trying to describe. His father disapproved of Christianity, not violently, precisely. He sat Zhi-min down when the boy was 9 and explained that the foreign religion was a distraction from the practical business of living, and that practical business was the only business worth attending to. His older brothers agreed. They were already working in the shop, already learning to read the ledgers, already becoming versions of their father. They found their younger brother's interest in the gathering at the neighbor's house faintly embarrassing. The way one finds a child's attachment to an invisible friend embarrassing, with the quiet expectation that he would outgrow it. He didn't outgrow it. He grew into it instead, the way a tree grows into a wall, slowly, persistently, without drama, until one day you realize the two cannot be separated. By the time he was 16, he had read the New Testament 4 times. He borrowed a copy of Augustine's Confessions from a missionary teacher and carried it inside his shirt because he didn't want his father to see. He began to feel, in a way he couldn't articulate, that he was not meant for the shop, that the ledgers were not his columns to fill. His father saw this and said nothing. His brothers saw this and made quiet jokes. His mother saw this and nodded. Once, with the particular certainty of someone who has already prayed about a thing and received the answer. He left home at 19 to attend a Christian academy in Shanghai. His father gave him exactly enough money for the first semester and made it clear that the supply would not continue indefinitely. His brothers stood in the doorway of the shop as he left, and one of them called out, not unkindly, "Good luck preaching to the fish." Everyone laughed. Zhi-min kept walking. Shanghai was nothing like the province. It was layered and loud and indifferent in the way that only very large cities can be indifferent. Not hostile, just completely unaware of you. He arrived with 1 bag and 3 addresses, written on a scrap of paper, and found a room in a building that smelled permanently of boiled cabbage. He was happy, not in spite of the difficulty, because of some quality inside the difficulty that he was only beginning to understand. He studied hard. He was not the most gifted student in his class. There was a boy from Guangdong who could recite entire books of scripture from memory, and a girl from a missionary family who spoke 4 languages with the ease of someone changing clothes. Zhi-min worked slower, thought deeper, wrote in the margins of everything. His professors noted that he asked the kind of questions that took 3 weeks to answer properly. They didn't always mean it as a compliment. In his 2nd year, he began to feel the call to preach. It arrived not as a lightning bolt, but as a pressure, a persistent, low-grade pressure behind the sternum, like something waiting to be released. He started small, speaking at the academy's prayer meetings, then at a small church 2 bus rides from his room. He was not a natural orator. He knew this. His voice was not commanding. He spoke in a way that some people found too direct and others found too quiet, and he had a habit of pausing mid-sentence for longer than audiences expected, until the silence became almost uncomfortable, and then saying the next thing into that silence with the calm of someone who had been waiting for exactly that moment. A few people found it powerful. Most people found it odd. He graduated at 22 and was given, through a missionary organization, a small appointment in a river town 4 hours from Shanghai. The town had a population of 8,000 people, a market that ran on Tuesdays and Fridays, and exactly no interest in what he had to say. The first Sunday, 11 people came. That was because they were curious about the new arrival. The second Sunday, 6 came. The curiosity had been satisfied. The third Sunday, 3 came. An elderly woman who was nearly deaf, her granddaughter who came to translate what she missed, and a man who appeared to have entered the wrong building and didn't want to be rude. Hu Zhi-min stood at the front of that room and preached. He preached to the deaf woman and the girl and the confused man as though he were preaching to 10,000. Not because he was performing, because he genuinely believed that what he had to say was worth saying regardless of who was listening. This was either his greatest strength or a form of selective blindness, and for a long time he couldn't have told you which. This went on for 2 years. 2 years of small rooms and smaller congregations. 2 years of walking dusty roads to neighboring villages and speaking to people who were polite enough to listen and unmoved enough to forget him by nightfall. His missionary contact sent a letter at the end of the first year asking for a report on conversions. Hu Zhi-min wrote back truthfully. None confirmed. He received a letter in return that was carefully worded in the way that letters are carefully worded when the writer is disappointed but trained in diplomacy. He read it once and used it to prop up the short leg of his desk. He did not write home often. When he did, he kept the letters factual. His father did not ask questions about the work. His mother wrote back every time, and her letters were short and said versions of the same thing. I am praying. Do not be afraid. He was not afraid. That was not quite the problem. The problem was quieter than fear. It was the creeping suspicion, arriving always around 2 in the morning, that perhaps he had misread everything. That the pressure behind his sternum was not a calling but an ambition he had dressed up in religious language to make it feel more noble. That he was not, in fact, special. That the small rooms and the empty benches were not a temporary season, but the actual shape of his life. He went to the river on those nights. It was not far, 20 minutes on foot along a path he had walked so many times he could navigate it without a lantern. He sat at the edge and watched the water move and asked God the same question he had been asking for 2 years, in different forms, all meaning the same thing. What am I doing here? He never received an answer he could write down. He received something else instead, a quality of stillness that was different from the stillness of despair. A sense, not a voice, not a vision, just a sense that the question was being heard, that the silence was not indifference. He would walk back in the dark with nothing resolved and somehow lighter, and he would sleep, and in the morning he would do it all again. This is what nobody tells you about the long season of nothing, that it is doing something to you while appearing to do nothing at all. In the spring of his second year, he fell ill. It started as fatigue, the kind he'd been carrying so long he'd stopped noticing it. Then came the cough, persistent and dry, then nights of sweating through his thin mattress. He traveled to Shanghai for examination and received the news about his lung in the government building, with the man in the white coat. He had not planned on dying at 23. He walked out into the street and stood watching the cart horse and thought about the river and his mother's letters and the 3 people who had sat in his room on that third Sunday, and he felt something strange happen inside his chest. Not peace, exactly, but a narrowing, a clarification, as though the diagnosis had burned away everything that was not essential and left only the question that actually mattered. Not what am I doing here, but what should I do with whatever I have left? He wrote to his missionary contact and said he needed to come to Shanghai for medical treatment. He found a room near a hospital. He began receiving treatment, primitive by any modern standard, expensive, exhausting. He was losing weight. Some days he could not stand without the room tilting sideways. On those days he read. He read everything he could find, not just scripture but history, biography, science, the accounts of other people who had stood in impossible places and somehow remained standing. He came across a journal written by a Welsh revivalist who had seen a small coal mining town transformed over the course of 3 months. People who hadn't stepped inside a church in decades suddenly filling every available seat, not because of theatrical preaching or miraculous signs, but because of prayer. Long, sustained corporate prayer that seemed to change the atmosphere of the place itself. Zhi-min read this account 4 times. The 5th time he read it, he began to weep. He was not an emotional man. He did not weep easily. But something in that account cracked something open in him. Perhaps the contrast between those full rooms and his empty ones. Perhaps the Welsh revivalist's own account of years of obscurity before the breakthrough. Perhaps simply the evidence that God had done this before and might do it again. He sat on the edge of his bed in his room near the hospital and wept for a long time. And when he was finished, he felt strangely clean, the way air feels after a storm. He began to pray differently, not the careful theological prayers of his academy training, not even the honest but measured prayers he'd been offering at the river. Something rawer, something that dispensed with form entirely, and was simply him speaking to God the way a person speaks when they've run out of composed language and have only the unpolished thing left. He prayed for the river town. He prayed for the people who had sat in his room. He prayed for people he hadn't met yet, in places he couldn't name. He prayed past the point where he had words and into the point where he simply sat in silence, with his hands open on his knees. The medical treatment continued. He did not improve dramatically. He improved incrementally, so slowly that he sometimes couldn't tell if he was improving at all. But the 6 months became 7, and then 8, and then a year had passed and he was still alive. His doctor said he did not understand it. Zhi-min said, "I do." He returned to the river town in the summer of what should have been his final year, with lungs that were damaged but functioning, and a certainty he couldn't have explained to anyone that something was about to change. He was right. He didn't know what form the change would take. He still had no congregation to speak of. He had no resources, no official appointment, no organizational backing. He had a room and a Bible, and the habit of prayer he had developed during his months of illness. He went back to the river on his first night and sat in his old spot and told God he was there, and then he sat quietly for a long time, listening. 3 weeks after he returned, a man named Old Chen came to find him. Old Chen was not a Christian. He was in his 60s, weathered and slightly bent, with the hands of someone who had worked outdoors his entire life. He had heard, through the particular grapevine that operates in small river towns, that there was a young preacher who had come back from near death. He was curious. He sat in Zhi-min's small room and asked, with the directness of a man who had lived long enough to have no patience for preamble, "Is it true you were dying?" Zhi-min said yes. Old Chen said, "Then why aren't you dead?" Zhi-min told him, not in a polished way. He told him about the government building and the cart horse and the nights at the river and the Welsh revivalist's journal and the strange, incremental, medically unexplained recovery. He told him all of it because Old Chen had asked a real question and deserved a real answer. Old Chen sat quietly for a long time when Zhi-min finished. Then he said, "I'll come Sunday." He came Sunday. He brought his wife. His wife brought her sister. The sister had a neighbor who was curious. Within 4 weeks, there were 23 people in that small room, sitting on whatever they could find, crowding into the doorway on warm evenings to listen through the open window. Zhi-min did not change his preaching. He didn't become more theatrical or more strategic. He preached the same way he always had, directly, with those long pauses, with the quality of someone who was saying things they genuinely believed were matters of life and death. The difference was that now the room was full, and somehow that made the pauses land differently, made the silences feel charged rather than awkward. He did not understand why the town was responding now, and not before. He prayed about it, and came to a conclusion that he could never prove, but that felt true to him. The years of empty rooms had not been wasted years. They had been the years during which God was forming something in him that could not be formed any other way. The patience. The willingness to speak to 3 people with the same conviction he'd speak to 3,000. The ability to sit at a river in the dark and receive nothing and return the next morning and try again. You cannot manufacture that. It cannot be acquired by strategy. It comes only through the sustained endurance of the thing you most want to avoid. The room outgrew the room. He moved the gatherings to a courtyard. Then the courtyard outgrew itself, and he arranged to use the open field at the edge of town where the Tuesday and Friday markets normally stood. The first time they used it, he was not sure anyone would come. The field felt enormous, exposed, a long walk from the nearest buildings. He arrived early and stood in the center of it and looked at the empty space, and felt for a moment that old familiar vertigo of the 2 a.m. question. What am I doing here? But this time the question had a different tone to it. It was not despair. It was something more like wonder. That evening, 400 people came. They came from the town and from the villages Hu Zhi-min had walked to during his 2 silent years, the villages where people had listened politely and appeared unmoved. It turned out they had not been unmoved. They had been watching, waiting to see what he was, whether he would stay, whether the thing he carried was real or performance. The small river town had been doing what small towns always do, taking the measure of a stranger over a long and unhurried time. He had passed the test without knowing he was being tested. Within a year, the field gatherings were drawing more than 2,000 people on a given night. Hu Zhi-min brought in other preachers to help. Men and women he had met at the academy. People he had corresponded with during his illness. They came, and they brought their own communities, and those communities brought their neighbors. And the thing grew in the way living things grow, not by being engineered but by being tended. The missionary organization that had written him the diplomatically disappointed letter wrote again. This time the tone was different. He wrote back the same way he'd always written back, with the facts cleanly stated. He didn't embellish. He had learned, during the years of nothing, that embellishment was a form of insecurity. The need to make a thing sound bigger than it was because you weren't sure the thing itself was enough. He had stopped needing that. The thing itself was enough. His mother came to visit in the autumn of what had become a remarkable year. She was older than he'd expected. The years had been doing their work while he'd been away. But her eyes were the same, and when she stood in the field in the evening light and watched the people gathering, she didn't say anything. She just took his hand and held it. He thought of the mornings of his childhood, watching her kneel in the dark and pray. He thought about what it meant to spend years doing something that looked like nothing from the outside while something was being formed on the inside. He thought about the cart horse on the Shanghai street and the river at 2 a.m, and old Chen sitting in his room asking the one question that changed everything. He preached that night to the largest gathering the field had ever held. He stood in the center of that enormous space and felt the familiar pressure behind his sternum. The one he'd first felt as a teenager in Shanghai. The one he'd questioned through 2 years of empty rooms. The one he'd carried through illness and recovery, and the slow, unexpected unfolding of whatever this was. He opened his mouth and began to speak. He was not looking for the extraordinary. He had never been looking for the extraordinary. He had only ever been looking for the obedient path. The next step in front of him, however small, however unremarkable it appeared. The extraordinary, it turned out, had been looking for him all along. It simply needed to know whether he would stay when nothing was happening. He stayed. He always stayed. And that, in the end, is the whole story. Though it is also, if you are willing to hear it, the beginning of yours.